Welcome. Welcome to the Ministry Forum podcast, coming to you from the Center for Lifelong Learning at Knox College, where we connect, encourage, and resource ministry leaders all across Canada as they seek to thrive in their passion to share the gospel. I am your host, the Reverend John Borthwick, Director of the Center and Curator of all that is ministryforum.ca. I absolutely love that I get to do what I get to do, and most of all, that I get to share it all with all of you. So thanks for taking the time out of your day to give us a listen, whether you're a seasoned ministry leader or just beginning your journey. This podcast is made with you in mind. Well, welcome. I'm delighted to have Dr. Laura Alary as a guest on the Ministry Forum podcast today. Laura and I overlapped when I was at Knox College, and so was she, when we were studying for our MDivs way back when.
Way back.
Exactly. We even had a chance to attend the Canadian Theological Students Conference as representatives of Knox, way back when it was held at the Atlantic School of Theology. It was kind of a homecoming for Laura, but my first time in the Atlantic provinces, and I've been blessed to be there several other times throughout my life and career. So welcome, Laura. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today.
Thank you, John. I'm just delighted to have the opportunity to talk with you.
Yeah, excellent. And we get to work together now. What a odd fate that life has taken us in these directions. So it's been a while. Let's catch up a little for the Ministry Forum audience. Maybe you decided to do more schooling and all those kinds of things. And now you're into the work that you do at the college. And we're going to talk a lot about the other kinds of things you do as an author. But maybe just give me a sort of a sketch of what have you been up to for the last 20 some odd years?
Oh, more than that, John. So when we were at Knox together, that was in the mid-90s. As you mentioned, I grew up in Halifax, Nova Scotia, went to school there. I did my undergrad. I did a degree in classics at Dalhousie. And after I finished that, my intention, believe it or not, was to become an Egyptologist. That was my life goal from the time I was, I think, 11 or 12 years old. And then when I got to university, maybe I'm going back further than you intended, but anyway, when I got to university age, I just wasn't quite ready to decamp to Toronto yet, which is where I would have to have gone to do ancient Near Eastern studies. So I did the next best thing, which was classics in Halifax at Dal, and really enjoyed the degree. But as I was nearing the end of it, this recurring question kept popping up, and that was the "so what" question. Like, what is the purpose of what I'm studying? I found it very interesting, but I guess I just reached a point where I felt like I wanted to contribute in some purposeful way to the world, but I didn't know what that was or what to do with this interest I had in the ancient world and ancient languages and literature and so on. And somehow, out of this, whirlpool of wondering, I decided I was going to study theology and came to Knox partly as a bit of an experiment, I think, just to see what that was like to be in the MDiv program. So I was in the MDiv program from 92 until 96. As you know, there was that brief window of time where it was a 4-year program instead of 3-year, and I just hit that exactly on. Got to the end of that and realized that these academic interests and aspirations that I had had for so many years were still with me. So I redirected them still toward the ancient world. So I did a PhD in New Testament, and that took me a long time. I didn't finish that degree until 2003, and I convocated in November, and then the following month, my first child was born. So that was another one of these turning points, and my colleagues, fellow students, were all establishing themselves in academic careers. And I certainly know other women who had young children and did that at the same time. However, we also have to make these decisions for ourselves and figure out what works best for us. And I felt that for me at that time in my life, and given my personality, um, just dividing myself in that way wasn't going to work. So I stepped off the academic path completely, and I stayed home to raise first my son, and then he was followed fairly quickly by two daughters. And that started me on a whole different kind of lifelong learning. Um, Not less than what I'd been doing, but very different. And in some ways, I think it brought me back to a much older path that I had left behind, and that is um, storytelling, teaching, playing with language. Um, yeah, and so ultimately that. Anyway, I'm going to fast forward then. Um, Quite a number of years. I was home with my kids for about 15 years. And then a whole lot of things in my life changed, and I found myself in need of employment. And despite all of the degrees, sorry, I lacked experience. So I ended up for a couple of years, believe it or not, teaching music at a small Montessori school, and toyed with a whole bunch of options, like, should I go back and do an education degree? Should I do Montessori education? Should I do music train? What on earth should I do? Um, Tried out a few things, and then still just hadn't settled anywhere. And then um, one summer, I happened to see an ad on Facebook for a part-time job at Cabin Library at Knox, and it with the hours and the demands of it just worked so perfectly with my young family. I thought, this is it. Like, this, I don't even have my CV with me, but I need to cobble something together and apply for this now, because I think the deadline was in a couple of days. um, anyway, long story short, I ended up working first part-time, and then my hours have increased at Cabin Library. Um, Despite not actually being a librarian, I am library assistant two, which really makes me laugh because, to the best of my knowledge, there is no library assistant one, unless there's one hidden in a closet somewhere. Um, so the other thing I do, though, is I'm coordinator of the Mackay Educational Resource Center, which is a special collection focused on faith formation, Christian education, congregational life, current theological and social issues. And within that, we have our picture books in ministry collection, which is it's kind of a passion project for me. I'm always trying to share my own love. I think of myself kind of as a picture book evangelist, and I'm always trying to help other people see the value of picture books and how they can be useful in so many settings. So, in a
That's
nutshell.
amazing. Yeah, that's a path. What I find fascinating is in talking to lots of folks around how they got to Knox uh, for like their MDiv
Hmm.
or even an MPS in those conversations as well. And certainly my story is similar. There's kind of a sense. There's a lot of that sense of I think I'll try this out,
Mm.
or I wonder if this is the place for me. And then discerning that sort of space uh, as one does a degree. And that's been a fascinating conversation because so often I think many of us have been wired, or maybe the people who invested heavily in us going on to advanced degree work or doing university education or college education have make assumptions of like, this is your path. This is
Mhm.
what you're going to do. And then what are you going to do with it? And, there's this sort of sense that everything's supposed to match and fall into place. And yet for so many, discernment happens not only within the space of education, but then discernment happens as a lifelong journey, right? It's
Yes.
it's not a, it's not a once and done for so many people, and for people who are listening, that sense of so many of us. maybe as we get older, have a sense of, this is, how did I get here?
Hmm.
If you're looking back, it's like, this is not where I imagined I would be, but wow, what a topsy turvy journey that got me to this space.
Yeah, and I've enjoyed listening to conversations with previous guests because I do think, well, in my experience anyway, there was a quite a high intimidation factor around the language of call. And in some cases, I felt very specific expectations, like this is what a call should be and this is what it should feel like. And I didn't find that people talked very much about discernment beyond the decision to go to seminary. Um, but as you say, yeah, it's ongoing.
And maybe just because I know we're going to switch gears in just a second, maybe just to do a good advertisement for Knox College and Cavan Library, maybe you could speak just for a minute or two just on the opportunities for those who are, I believe, graduates of Knox that they have related to the library itself and
Hmm.
being able to take out books or connect with books, and then maybe also just a bit on the Mackay and how people can connect with that resource, even though it's physically located in Toronto at the
Right.
University of Toronto and at Knox College. There is a way where that can be spread more widely.
Yeah, well, as you say, I mean, we do have a beautiful bricks and mortar building and
Mhm.
physical books, and here we are, and we're always happy to see people. I'm on the circ desk. I'm more than happy to welcome visitors, but we do take seriously our commitment to alumni as well, and not only alumni but also other church leaders. So, if you're a minister, a diaconal minister, um, a lay leader within the Presbyterian Church in Canada, you can apply for a Knox College library card, which will allow you access to our print collection. Now, unfortunately, not our ebooks. That's a whole licensing agreement with the U of T that we don't control. Um, but we will mail stuff to you. We will mail books, up to about 5 at a time, anywhere in Canada at no charge. So, we've got a handful of alumni who do take advantage of this, but we would love for more people to take us up on the offer. Um, and what else was I going to say? Oh, Mackay. So
Mhm.
I did mention a little bit about the focus of Mackay, um, and the picture books and ministry portion of it. We also do a series of webinars, usually 2 a year. And you can actually, if you go to the college website, I'm trying to visualize the tabs in my head and I can't. But if you search for Mackay Grow webinars, you can see recordings of previous ones. You can see what's up and coming. So that's a good way of not only connecting people across distances, but also cross denominations. Um, let's see. Have I forgotten anything, John?
I think that's great. Yeah, that's excellent. There's a lot to you as a person who works in the space you work in. You've got to keep a lot of things in your mind. So that's perfect. That's awesome. Let me just say a little bit about a passion for picture books. I've always in ministry and maybe my whole life long, but certainly in ministry, I've always enjoyed the way in which a picture book, like really good quality picture books with the beautiful illustrations or actual pictures, um, and simple writing that conveys a story and moves a story along. I can remember in ministry the number of different times and different iterations that I would share that either say with a Christmas Eve service or
Mhm.
just other parts of the year. It, we've transformed this, and I don't know if we're going to talk about this specifically as we go along, but what I found transformative during the pandemic and probably violating a lot of copyright laws is the number of people who basically took pictures of picture books and then put them on screens and then shared
Mhm.
them in live streaming. And it's like, oh dear, I don't think you're supposed to do that without getting proper licensing or permissions and things like that. So maybe that's just a cautionary note. But even just as a minister of a congregation, um, children's stories have not always been my favorite part of a service.
Mhm.
How one tells a good children's story that's well thought out, and so often I would use a picture book as a way, with a group of kids, not video
Mhm.
recorded,
Right.
up at the front, and just sharing. a picture book to give a solid message that's been well thought out and well curated by an author, and then beautiful visuals that's both stimulates an adult mind and a younger person's mind. So I just want to shout out to the joy and celebration of picture books, and as we're going to find out, that's been a part of your journey.
Yes, it has. And thank you for that. It's funny because I sort of had it in the back of my mind that if you didn't ask me, why should ministry leaders care about picture books? I was going to circle back to it at the end, because, but maybe it's better to talk about it at the beginning. Um, and it's helpful, I think, for you to share your experience sharing picture books in worship, because that's an obvious way to use them. And honestly, it's not uncommon for people to contact me at the Mackay Center and say, okay, I'm preaching here and this is my theme, or these are the texts for the day. Can you recommend a picture book? Um, and I love playing matchmaker in this way. So yeah, that's another way we try to serve and support our alumni. Um, some people, it's not uncommon, I think, for ministers who are very experienced and very competent in many areas to be terrified of children's stories. Partly because they can be really unpredictable, right? Um, so yeah, reading a good picture book is an excellent way. And I was going to say to fill that space, but it makes it sound very reductionist. That's not what I mean. Um, do you want me to keep going about why picture books are
Yeah, no, please do.
okay?
I think this could be a helpful conversation for folks to hear. Yeah, just why picture books. Yeah.
Okay, so, well, first of all, because I think they're a really excellent introduction to any topic, but particularly difficult or sensitive ones. Just a way of opening up conversation and wondering in a gentle kind of way. The other thing about picture books is that I think more than any other genre, they're intergenerational and they're communal. I mean, they're meant to be read aloud in a group when you're physically together. So that makes them particularly good for worship. I mean, who doesn't love to sit and listen to a story? For so many people, there's a strong nostalgic dimension to that, but it's also kind of wired into us as human beings that we love stories. Um, but I'd take it a step further and say, apart from any utilitarian value, good picture books, and I say good picture books, um, are spiritually nurturing. And I'm not just talking about the religious ones here. We actually did a webinar at the Mackay Center with Hannah Brown Schock, who's the creator of Picture Book Theology, excellent resource. And she talks a lot about this, about using not explicitly religious books in church settings. I think what the genius of picture books is that they're taking important ideas or experiences or concepts and distilling them to what's most essential. So they're they're not watered down. Um, I think actually they can be more potent than a longer form text because they've been distilled. Um, take a look at pretty much any book by Matt de la Pena. Um, Last Stop on Market Street is one of my favorite picture books of all time. Milo Imagines the World. Both those books have really profound things to say about perception, the way we see the world, the things that we notice, the things we don't notice. Um, yeah, like I could I could go on and on. I think good picture books leave space for wondering and for curiosity. Like they don't tell us everything. They're kind of like parables in that sense. They make us work to try to figure out, well, what might this story be saying to me at this point in my life or to us? And I think the older I get, the more I believe that curiosity is an essential spiritual practice. Um, it keeps us playful, it keeps us open to new possibilities, and it also, I think, keeps us humble so we don't assume too quickly that we know what's going on, we understand everything, that's what's true, what's false, what needs to happen. Um, I heard an interview one time with Padre Tuama, and he was talking about the importance of being curious about other people, especially those you don't agree with, and genuinely asking, I wonder why this person believes what they do or believes the way they do. I wonder, what need that belief is meeting for them. I mean, you may never get an answer, but just asking the question uh, helps counteract the tendency to to leap to a quick judgment. And I mean, maybe it will lead to deeper understanding.
Hmm.
So picture
Yeah,
books, good for the soul.
they absolutely are. And my intersection with picture books was when I was in my pre-Knox years. I hung out with people who were in the illustration program at Sheridan College,
Oh,
and
interesting.
and so some of their projects were actually illustrating picture books. And so uh, we speak about, certainly there's a, and I think we're going to touch on this as you talk about the work that you do, the craft of the writer to
Hmm.
to be concise and to get just the right words, but the word counts are pretty small on a picture
Hmm.
book. But also for the illustrator to match with the writer and to craft a picture that expresses in, each picture as it expresses an element or a sense of the words as they go forward. Illustrated Ministry is a resource, and I used them a lot during the pandemic because what they offered was a picture, one picture,
Hmm.
and then just that sense of wondering. And I used it for the entire congregation, both virtually, and then once we came out of virtual completely, it was that hybrid thing, and it just gave them a sense of, this picture goes on the screen, and then we just have this sense of wondering around the story, and
Hmm.
how powerful illustration along with the words can really uh, evoke some really sense of curiosity, wondering, and meaning making, all in the mix.
And that's actually when I referred to picture books as communal. Um, I should have included the illustrator in that. I didn't, but as I'm listening to you talking, I'm thinking, yes, that's another thing that makes them communal because you have two conversation partners. You've got the writer and you've got the illustrator. And even if they never meet one another in person, they're both contributing to telling this story. And I have had to learn so much about the process of illustration so I can learn how to get out of the way and let the illustrator do their work. Because when I first started, I thought, oh, the illustrator looks at my words and draws what's written there. No, no, no. It's far, far more than that. In fact, I think the best and the most compelling illustrations are ones that don't just literally interpret what's on the page, but
Mhm.
create some kind of a distance between them. And then there's this sort of gap between what the words say and what the pictures are describing, and then the reader can come to that and sort of interpret it their own way. And it's just a very exciting dance.
So, what was your first foray? You've done that. You did the advanced degree. You're raising a family. You know, you talked about storytelling and as being a part of who you were in your life. That it was a return to a call or a calling within yourself. How did you step into it in the first iteration? Because you went from writing a dissertation
Yeah.
to now writing, hey, let's write, how many words are in a typical children's book? A
L-
thousand? Less?
less.
Yeah, less. Wow. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so there's kind of two answers to that, I guess. Um, so I'll deal with it in two parts. So I do have a lifelong love of picture books themselves. Like I've always enjoyed them. I collected them long before I had kids. Um, I used to, make create like when I was a little child, make my own books and write stories in them and illustrate them. So I've had a love for that format for a long, long time. I also love the oral storytelling tradition. So it wasn't just picture books I loved, it was folk tales, fairy tales from around the world. I started teaching Sunday school when I was 14 because they just needed people. And so I got slotted in there. And the best part of it for me was telling stories. I absolutely loved being a storyteller. And by the time I was an undergrad, I remember taking this course from a man named Tom Sinclair Faulkner. Now, he was actually a prof in the Department of Religion at Dal at that time. But I'm pretty sure he was United Church of Canada. Anyway, he ran this like 3-evening course on biblical storytelling, and it was awesome. I mean, I was just, I think, 19 when I took it, but it's the first time that I actually sat down and thought carefully about how stories actually work and the different elements in them. Um, and that, that little 3-night course still informs me, I think. Um, I never planned, though, to be a writer for children. Like I say, there was this whole Egyptology trajectory that didn't happen. When I finished my PhD, though, there were 2 things that factor into the story. The first is I had a horrible case of writer's block. So this lifetime of reading and writing for pleasure, um, all of a sudden just got choked off completely. And I think it had something to do with putting so much energy into um, academic writing that was reviewed and critiqued. Um, well, I was going to say harshly. That's not really fair. But when you write a thesis, the whole point is that people are going to try to attack it and knock it down, and you need to defend it. That didn't come naturally to me. I I yeah, I struggled with academic writing. I struggled with my own inner editor that wanted every single word to be perfect. So by the time I used an analogy one time about this lime tree that my mom tried to grow in our house in Halifax, and it after many years it brought forth one lime, and then it promptly died from the effort. So that's kind of how writing a thesis felt for me. I thought, okay, I can do this. I can do this. And I squeezed out these 350 pages, and then I couldn't write anything. Like, I couldn't write in my journal. I couldn't write a letter, because every time I went to write a word, I was critiquing it. And I felt so sad, because this thing that had been a source of pleasure and consolation to me my whole life was gone. And I didn't know what to do about it. But then the other thing, of course, was at that very time I became a mom. Um, so I was kind of catapulted from academic life into a whole different kind of life at home with this infant, saying to myself, well, now here I am. I have to shape this human life, and I'm not quite sure how to do it. Like I have a vision, but I don't have any experience, and what am I going to do? So um, instinctively, I knew that books and stories were going to be part of this somehow. So I started taking my baby son to the library. We went to storytelling concerts. I was constantly making up songs and rhymes, and just playing with words. I bought collections of folk and fairy tales, which were way above his head, but that's okay. I just wanted him to hear language. I wanted him to touch books, to understand how they worked. So we were both immersed in story. And as I did this, it occurred to me that this actually might help me through my own impasse with writing. So I decided to try to write a story for Ian. That's my son. And I just fell in love with the process of doing it, and just kept on and on. I did, in those early days, through a friend of a friend, got an opportunity to show some of my stories to a real editor, somebody from KidsCan, actually. And it was a really hard conversation on the phone. She did her best to be encouraging, and she did say to me, "You have some good ideas, but," and then there was this whole laundry list of things that I wasn't doing well. But that was really important learning for me, because I I realized that although it may seem to be a simple thing to write a picture book, it's actually far more difficult than people assume. Um, it's a whole craft. But I decided this is something I really want to get better at. So I kept at it. The first book that I had accepted for publication was a book called Is That Story True? And it's very quirky in its theme. Really, it has to do with um, literal versus metaphorical truth, which doesn't sound like a likely topic for a picture book, but I do think it works. Anyway, Woodlake decided to take a chance on this, um, and I've always been grateful to them for giving me that first opportunity. And then I subsequently published other books with them, and then, over the years, kept banging on the doors of the Canadian indie publishers, and gradually broke through in that area as well. Um, yeah.
Yeah, I really want our audience to understand, and maybe they do, but just the sense of um, the gift at being able to tell a story or express a message in such a short kind of compact kind of way.
Hmm.
I have a friend whose son. Actually, it's weird. I had two individuals in my life. So I had a friend in the community who he had heard that I think Ernest Hemingway used to write these tiny things,
Hmm.
and Ernest Hemingway wrote massive volumes, like massive books. But one of his practices was to write something really short, as short as could be. And so this friend of mine, he started doing it on social media. And then at
Hmm.
the same time, very similar time, another friend of mine's son, Skylar Hammond, created what he called tiny stories. And
Hmm.
so his stories are even shorter. And he just got picked up by TVO to do these short little episodes like the in between TVO shows. And so now they're doing a video kind of aspect. He created a picture book. And it's basically a story that's, I don't know, is it 100 words? Is it, I don't, it seems they're
It,
really short, but they tell us sort of in just a few lines, it sort of it expands your imagination. So the craft of, and especially for folks who've been preachers,
hmm.
um, there's always that sense of, but I got so much to say. Like, how would I ever distill that? Or when someone asks you, how would you sum up your sermon in 3 sentences? And sometimes that's a tool that you're supposed to use as a way of crafting, making sure you're actually telling one story or giving
Hmm.
a message. But I know a lot of preachers who have a really hard time distilling. So I just want to just honor that work as a picture book author. How that comes together is a real craft, a real gift.
It's definitely a discipline. And it's interesting that you should mention preaching because I frequently fall back on my background in preaching. And I have to give a shout out to Stephen Ferris because preaching prophet Knox while we were there. And I remember him saying, "You need to be able to tell me in a sentence what your sermon is about. And if you can't do it, then you need to go back and fix it because you don't know what it's about." And I'm paraphrasing there, but that was the message of it. And I have to do that all the time with picture books. Um, yeah, you need to be crystal clear because there's no fat. Like you just have to know every word you choose has to advance the story somehow.
Mhm, mhm.
Yeah.
And so you've written now a number of children's books and picture books.
Hmm.
Um, how many?
The one that came out last fall, All the Faces of Me, that was number 15.
Wow.
And then I've got five coming out in 2025. And then I guess five more over the next couple of years beyond that. 2025, though, that's an unusual year for me. And it just a lot of them, some their publication was delayed, and the plan originally wasn't to have all five of them come out at once. Two are coming out on the same day, which is definitely not desirable, but I'm not going to complain either. So,
Mhm. And where does your inspiration come? I've read a few. I haven't read all 15, but I've read some of your children's books and used some of them in worship. I think they're great.
mhm.
Where does your inspiration come from?
um, okay, so this may be a bit idiosyncratic, but I'm actually going to distinguish between inspiration and ideas. Um, because one thing that has helped me immensely um, is realizing that, well, first of all, okay, let me say, I I don't know where the inspiration comes from. That's the mysterious part of it. Like sometimes I'll just know what to do with an idea and I'll start writing. Other times I can have an idea, but it will sit with me for 7 years, and the inspiration just doesn't come. So there's the completely uncontrolled part of it. Where do ideas come from? Ideas are all over the place, and I don't create them. I just have to pay attention. So I try to make a practice of being observant. Like I watch people. I I listened in on conversations. I read a lot. I ask a lot of questions. So inspiration for specific stories has come from, in some cases, newspaper articles. In one case, somebody sent me something and said, "Hey, I think this would make a good story," and yeah, I agreed. Sometimes it will be a memory from my own childhood, or a little fragment of it that I can put with something else. Sometimes it's something that my own kids did when they were young. So, for example, one of the books that's coming out in May called "Wind Stop Blowing." It started out its life almost 20 years ago when I was at the park with my son Ian, and he'd spent all this time, like he was 2.5 or something like that, building this leaf pile, and he was going to go down the slide and land in it. And he'd worked so hard, and this rogue gust of wind came along and just blew the thing all over the place. And he stood in the playground and he raised his face to heaven and he just screamed, "Wind, stop blowing!" And I remember at the time laughing and laughing, but also thinking, oh my gosh, like that's this little symbol of human resistance to change. And I wrote it down in a book because if I don't write these things down, they'll evaporate and I lose them. And that's a story that I wrote and rewrote and submitted for, well, like I say, it's been about 18 years and it's finally coming out.
Wow.
So, and another book, what was I going to say? Oh, Sun in My Tummy. That one, it's about photosynthesis, although it doesn't use the word photosynthesis. But that one was stimulated by a question from a child at the Montessori school where I was working. He wanted to know where food comes from, and that led to a whole lunchtime conversation. And I thought, hey, I think I think I can do something with this. Um, what grew in Larry's garden? That was another one that was started life as a newspaper article. Um, yeah.
Mm, that's amazing. I I um I appreciate Elizabeth
Mm-hmm.
Gilbert, and she wrote a book a few
Big
years
magic.
back, Big Magic, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I love how she crafts and talks about inspiration. So just the nuance of how you described it, um, and this notion of demons, like inspiration and the connection of demons. The idea that a demon was not a bad thing; it was a thing that somehow came to you in an ancient way of speaking. There was a sort of a sense of the demon has come to you,
I think
and
she uses the word, she talks about genius too. Like
yeah.
genius is not a quality that certain people possess and others don't, but this mysterious visitor who kind of
Mhm.
drops into your life and you have to go, thank you,
Yeah, yeah.
thank you for visiting.
Well, and she talks about this idea. One of the things that really got me was when she talks about another author, and she doesn't name the author. I think I know who the author is, but she talks about she had this idea, and it kept coming to her, but it never. Uh, and I liked how you used the word. Someone sent you something, and I agreed, because I
Hmm.
think I think there's a play on that she uses as well. There's sort of a sense of, here's this idea. I have this idea for a book, or it's in me. It's coming. It has to come out somehow, but it's not coming. And then some other author did a book that was basically her exact idea. And people were, some, I guess, I don't know how people knew this, but some people were saying, isn't that what your idea was or whatever? And she was like, it wasn't for me. I didn't agree. Myself and
Interesting.
inspiration
Yeah.
didn't agree. And so this other person was given the idea. They, like, almost like inspiration comes and it'll move on if it doesn't get an agreement with someone. I think that's fascinating.
this is not the same thing that you're talking about, but it is something that I've observed in publishing that fascinates me. And that is, not only do you have trends, but um, I can't figure out who's setting the trends. So, for instance, a little while ago, I wrote this story that involved knitting, and I sent it off to multiple publishers, and I kept getting these notes back saying, "Oh, we just accepted a story about knitting last month." And I'm like, "What? Like, what's in the air right now?" And then that's happened to me with other things as well. And it's not that I'm consciously seeing books about knitting because they haven't even hit the shelves yet. Um, it's almost like being part of a murmuration of starlings or something, and everybody's just kind of going in different directions, but together. And it's a mystery to me. I don't quite know why that happens,
Yeah.
but it
There's
does.
there's this we're recording just before Christmas, and in the one of my favorite Christmas movies, Elf,
Hmm.
there it is a children's publisher. It's
Yes.
in the backstage, and that whole conversation with Peter Dinklage as this sort of expert guy who's come in to give them some ideas, and he's got his little book, and it's like, soft vegetables are too vulnerable, so we're not going to do that. And yeah, how people get those kind of that thinking. So you've already sort of noted it, and maybe it's a good segue into that question around, um, what have you've been doing this for quite some time? So what have you noticed in that, I guess, in the industry or in the publishing industry? What changes have you noticed? How have you had to adapt as you've gone along, or maybe what's been that lifelong journey for you, that lifelong learning journey you've been on since you started and published that first book?
Mhm.
How's it tracked for you? What have you noticed?
Well, one thing I've definitely noticed is that word counts have continued to drop.
Wow.
Yeah. So when I first started, I would say the general wisdom was you needed to keep your picture book at or just below 1,000 words. These days, I would never submit a manuscript for a picture book that was 1,000 words. Um, I keep it 800, sometimes lower than that. Um, and there's part of me. Well, actually, I should take a step back from that, because one of the books that I have coming out in 2026 is a picture book biography that's actually longer. It's also 48 pages as opposed to the standard 32, but it's also aimed at an upper elementary audience. So my hope is that maybe the market is opening a little bit toward illustrated books for older children. So rather than just having picture books be for the youngest readers and then moving into the like early readers that they can, I think there's all sorts of space for illustrated books for older elementary kids. So that's an aside. Um, but the word counts are dropping for sure. Um, and part of that, I think, is because attention spans are also shrinking, not only among children, I think adults as well. I mean, I'm a lifelong reader, but I also spend more time on social media than I ever imagined I would. So and I hate this phrase, but like I'm consuming short form content, and that's affected my attention span. And I'm very aware of that, and I try to do things to push back against it. But for children, it's really, really hard. So I think it's kind of chicken or egg. Like we're as we continue to drop word count, we make it worse. Um, Having said that, though, another part of me really likes the challenge of saying more with fewer words, because it is a craft and a discipline to do that. So yeah, so there's good and bad dimensions of it. Um, and I think another change um, has been the extent to which authors need to be involved in marketing or promoting their own books. And for some, that comes quite naturally. They really excel at it. And for others, like yours truly, it does not come naturally. It's a struggle.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, the other thing I've noticed, and this isn't a change, I don't think, but it speaks to change, like the constant change in the industry. There are trends. So the things that I started out thinking, oh, this is my genre. Like, I love picture book biographies. I love writing in a folktale style. Well, nobody wants that right now. Like, the market is saturated with picture book bios. So I keep writing them because I love them, but they're not finding homes. So I just kind of sit on those manuscripts hoping that maybe someday the market's going to shift again. I mean, I know that it will. Um, it's almost impossible to predict those trends though, because like everything in publishing happens so slowly. So for instance, I had a manuscript accepted over the summer, and it's coming out in spring 2028.
Oh.
So that's longer
Mm.
than it used to be when I started. Um, so you if you walk into um, chapters indigo or something like that, I sometimes I think it's like what you're seeing on the shelves is like light from distant stars. It seems fresh and dazzling and new, but it's actually taken a long time to reach you. So.
That's amazing. Yeah, the whole area of the publishing industry. I have a really good friend who has been intersected with that world quite a bit, especially Canadian children's authors,
Mhm,
children's publishers, book publishers, and yeah, it just the the real challenge to keep Canadian publishing houses operate those and keep them going is quite a struggle from what I've heard.
mhm.
And we've lost some over the years too that
Yeah.
were really solid ones that you could depend on as both as an author, illustrator, but also as somebody who appreciated what they would produce. Um, what I find interesting in that world is the how would I say is it, it, I don't know if this is true for everybody, but I would say for me personally, just as you were describing your relationship with your son, wanting him to feel and see and have a tactile book, of all the books that I would say people could purchase or would want to purchase, a picture book is one of the ones where you really wouldn't want that on an e-reader. um, you wouldn't want to consume that on a screen in the same way. I'm sure people are still publishing and moving it into those worlds, but
Mhm.
there's just something about investing in a hard cover most of the time, sometimes
Yeah.
soft cover, but
Mhm.
a hard cover picture book with a nice little dust cover and the whole tactileness. I mean, even with really, really little kids, we do the thing where you can actually feel and touch the pages.
Yeah.
Um, but there's just something about investing in a picture book that's way different probably from any other kind of book out there.
Yeah. I agree. And you're right. There is that tactile dimension. I mean, the book, we don't often think of it this way, but the book itself is an amazing piece of technology when you compare it to a scroll, for instance. Like, and so if you
Yeah.
watch a young child learn to do something like turn pages, and you have to teach them, no, you have to take the corner and turn it. You can't grab it from the inside. Um, and also having a child in your lap or snuggled up next to you, or children seated around you in a circle, you can't do that with an e-reader. It's not the same. I think I mean, a lot of books are made available in electronic form, and sometimes that's really useful if if you're in a classroom and you want to um, and you've got the rights to project images on a screen, or it's a good way of sharing a book with a large audience. But um, that's not they're not at their best, I don't think, in electronic form.
Mhm. Well, in this
And they
same sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and they really are, because sometimes people will say, um, talk about the cost of picture books, and I get it. Like, I don't have an infinite book budget either, but I do love to support other authors. I love to support independent bookstores when I can, and the more you're sort of part of the industry and you actually see what's involved in producing a picture book, you really realize that it's a piece of art
Mhm.
that I'm investing in here.
Yeah, it's definitely of all the books on my shelves that I've moved on several iterations, the picture books are the ones that stick around. Like
Hmm.
they, no matter what, they get moved, they get brought back, and they stay around. And I'll probably pass them on to, my kids and future generations, perhaps that they can
Yeah.
have that a chance to read those as well. The other phenomenon I've seen, and I think on your socials, because you're a social media influencer these days. I have a connection with an individual who ran a charity for quite some time, Good with Words, and what they did was they during the pandemic they got because they had the rights in these relationships with publishers and authors, they created these walking trails. So they
Oh,
a book
yeah,
trail, storytime trail was
yeah.
what they branded it as. I've seen other iterations of it. Some libraries are doing this just as a way of getting people outside and then getting the chance
Mhm.
to walk. So we did it actually at the church I used to serve in Guelph, at St. Andrews in Guelph. We did a couple of iterations where over a weekend we'd put these little, basically like election signs out
Yeah.
of a children's author, a Canadian children's author, and then it was a beautiful intergenerational experience where a family would come and read the book together and watch the kid go from one to the next, and they would read the book, and then it was a great way of also saying to parents and grandparents, hey, if you want to buy that book and have it at home, that'd be another wonderful way of seeing it. But I think you were a part of one of those very recently, within the last month or two.
Yeah, 2, in fact. I love story walks, and it just so happened that this fall, what grew in Larry's garden ended up as part of 2 different story walks. One with a church that actually abutted a retirement home. And so
Mm,
there was a pathway that led between the church and the retirement home, and they put the story walk along the path so that members of the congregation, the community, but also residents could come and just walk that short distance and read the story. So I thought that was really lovely.
mm,
Um, and then I got an email out of the blue from the principal of school in New York State, and
mm,
they said that they had just opened this. It was actually an incredibly beautiful garden space, kind of like almost an outdoor. I was going to say an atrium, but that would be indoors. It was an outdoor garden space for their kindergarten kids.
mm. Nice.
And they actually had it was so cool because they had permanent signs, but then you could open them and change what was in them. So what they did was they had all of the pages laid out, and then at the end, they had some information. I think they had a QR code that people could scan, and it had some downloadable question sheets and things like that. And then I wrote a card for them, and they put that in there as well, just sort of a little message to the kids. But yeah, it's a beautiful community building way of using a picture book. Although it was funny because I talked to the principal and she said the experience of actually cutting a book apart to make these things was hard for her, and I've never done that. I think I'd have a hard time with that too.
Mhm. Yeah, the individual that we worked with, they worked with a printer, and with the publishers to basically create that full
Okay.
size thing, and
Yeah,
they did the QR codes too, and sometimes would connect with the author, and have the author. So again, families could stand through the QR code, and then it would be like a video that would come up of the author talking
neat.
a little bit about the story. So yeah, I mean, for those who are listening, if you see a story walk, or if you're a church and you have a bit of a laneway, connect with some of these organizations that are doing this kind of stuff, or partner with libraries or cities. In Guelph, we had in the city, one of the city parks did this over a summer, and it was just three or four different books, just a beautiful way of again highlighting picture books and
Hmm.
Canadian authors, and again, these ones were also based on themes, so conversations around indigenous issues, conversations around racism, ableism, things like that. So books that sort of highlight diversity and things like that. It was a beautiful way of highlighting those, as you said earlier,
Hmm.
in a way, in a simple and yet complex and curious imagining kind of way. It was really neat. Um, so uh, when this podcast comes out, it'll be January,
Hmm.
and as you said, authors are supposed to share what's coming out. So you've got a new book coming out, and it's a part of a series. It's called Rise: A Children's Guide to Eastertide, and I love that part of let's say your ministry that you've been doing is connecting, seasons of the church year, uh, things that we would call theological concepts, and
Hmm.
all those kinds of things in the work that you're doing as well, in a really interesting and accessible way. So, can you tell us a bit more about Rise that's coming out? And you can say when, and then maybe talk a little bit about the series, and if you like, even share a bit of an excerpt of that book.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So yes, Rise is being published on January 14th, and kind of tricky timing in a way because we've just traveled through the arc of the church year: Advent, Christmas, Epiphany. We're just catching our breath, and it's going to be Lent. But we wanted to make sure that the book was available in plenty of time for Easter and Eastertide. So yeah, January 14th. um, Rise, as you mentioned, is part of a series, and it, I didn't realize when I started to write it that I was writing a series. Um, my work on the church year has come directly out of things that have been important in my own family, my own household. So I wanted to make the church year, the yeah, the rhythms of the church year, part of my own children's experience. And it was years ago, and I specifically wanted a book for Lent. And sorry, I'm not being very clear here. I had specific things in mind that I was looking for. And you have to keep in mind too, this was like 15 years ago or so. Um, I wanted the story of Jesus' death and resurrection to be set in the context of his whole life. So I didn't just want a story about his death. Um, I wanted to approach Lent as a more positive and purposeful time, something that was spacious rather than restrictive or even punitive, which is sometimes how I experienced it as a child. But I also wanted a book that would help children make connections between biblical stories, um, their own their own lived experience, and Lenten practices. So the things that we do during Lent, we don't just do because it's Lent, but they actually have a bigger purpose than that. So, I mean, that was my laundry list of what I wanted from a book, and not surprisingly, I couldn't find it. So I thought, well, I'm just going to write something. So I did. I wrote this book, and I used it in my own family for quite a number of years. And then I thought, maybe somebody else might be interested in this as well. So I shopped it around a little bit, and it was accepted by Paraclete Press. And it was actually quite well received. So I thought, well, maybe I should have a go at writing another one in a similar format. So I wrote one for Advent called Look. Um, and then a few years, well, more than a few years later, I guess, Breathe, A Child's Guide to Ascension, Pentecost, and the Growing Time came out. And then I thought I was done. I figured, okay, I've sort of hit the three great days. I've got Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, um, a nice little trilogy. And then my son said to me one day, when are you going to write one for Easter? And I said, well, Ian, Make Room is A Child's Guide to Lent and Easter. So we do end on Easter Sunday. And he said, well, what about the rest of it? And I was mortified to realize that I had left out the entire season of Eastertide, and all of the resurrection appearances, all of those stories. And I realized, this cannot be. Like I have to do something about this. Um, so I started thinking about the next book and how I was going to approach this season for children. It's got the same. I knew it was going to have the same format as the other books, because when you start writing a series, people come to expect that. And it also has kind of a central question, like all of the other books do. So at one point, the child narrator is thinking about this moment where Jesus meets, or rather, Mary encounters Jesus in the garden, and it makes her think about losses in her own life, like the death of her grandfather, the death of a beloved pet. And she says, Jesus came back to Mary. I wish those I love would come back to me. sometimes it's hard to see what Easter has to do with me. And that was kind of my starting point. Like, I think there's a lot of truth there. Easter, and again, I'm partly going on my own experience as a child, but also conversations I've had with other children over the years. It's hard to connect with an event that's not only so distant in time, but also utterly beyond our experience. So, if God made Jesus alive again, why doesn't God do that with the ones we love? So what has resurrection got to do with me? Like, that's the central question. So what I wanted to do in Rise was to explore a broader view of resurrection that includes fresh starts and new beginnings of different kinds. And I think that's justifiable because even in the biblical narratives, like those resurrection appearances, the empty tomb is not the only place where resurrection is happening. And I'm thinking especially of Peter, who is, and it's funny, when you look for children's books about Peter, there's not that many that cover this territory. He's so burdened by guilt and shame over his betrayal, his denial of Jesus. And I absolutely love the scene in the Gospel of John where he's on the beach with Jesus. Jesus has already fed him. Jesus has extended grace, but he's still not quite there yet. And Jesus keeps asking him, "Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me?" And it's so powerful because it ends with Jesus putting trust in Peter again. He gives him another chance. And I think that kind of resurrection is easier for us to identify with. And then once we start to see that resurrection is perhaps bigger and broader than we thought, we begin to see it and the risen Christ in all sorts of places. So if you'll bear with me, I'll actually read that little tiny piece from the book. So the larger context is, just for your readers who don't know the series, the books are subdivided into sections. And so this section is called On the Beach, and it starts with a retelling of part of the biblical story of Peter, and then it moves into contemporary reflections from the point of view of the child. So this is the child speaking. Resurrection is a big word. It means rise again. I used to think it was a word only for what happened to Jesus, but now I'm not so sure. Sometimes we all trip and fall, but falling does not have to be the end of the story. Jesus' friend Peter did something bad because he was scared, but Jesus let him try again. I like how Jesus feeds his friends, even if they didn't really deserve it. I like how he gives Peter another chance to show what he can do. Maybe Jesus could see that Peter was much more than the mistake he made. Maybe this is resurrection too. So I guess to kind of sum up the series, I'd say that I'm always trying to connect scripture and the liturgical seasons with the actual lives of children. And I would say that this is it's my way of helping them develop the habit of kind of wondering, where am I in the story? Where is it part of me? Where does it feel familiar or true?
Yeah, and what would you hope? Who would you hope would be using this? Families, church schools, or what are you thinking?
I'm thinking all of the above.
Yeah,
It's, I think, a really good resource for families who want to have regular faith practices as part of their home life. Um, Definitely, it could be used in worship as part of a Christian education program. One thing that people ask me sometimes is, how do I use it? Because it is much longer than a conventional picture book. Like, the word count in these is, I think it's closer to 2,000 words. So it's way above your standard picture book. And if you were to sit down and read it, it would take 15 minutes. Um, but you don't have to just sit down and read it. Like I say, it is subdivided into sections. So you could just choose one section, just read the biblical story followed by the child's reflection. And then I'll also let you know that there is a free downloadable discussion and activity guide available from the publisher, also on the product page on my website. But it's got all kinds of ideas for things to read and do and talk about. So
Yeah, I really appreciate that. Over the years in preaching, sometimes I would use different resources, often from uh, basically intended for children, but as a way of engaging and even sharing as a part of, say, the creation of a sermon.
mhm,
Just that sense of, we can look to academic commentaries, but you could also look to how someone is trying to retell the story or shape the concepts in the story from a child's point of view. And so I think that's beautiful what you read, um, because I think sometimes we forget that many people in the pews may also still have a child's point of view of some of these big theological concepts, and so how do we make that accessible for some folks? If we go the no offense to the academic route, but if we go full on academic route, we may lose people in the midst of that. So how do we have a good balance of making sure that we're connecting with people at the level that they might be at, or the way in which they've I've found some people lock into theological concepts like resurrection at a
mhm,
young age, and then it doesn't get unpacked or doesn't get uh, uh, it doesn't evolve through their life. So sometimes they're listening to sermons and they hear a word resurrection. They're going back to how they understood it from a long, long time ago.
mhm. Yeah, and I think another thing that a book like this can do um, is to model that kind of beginner's mind when it comes to these sorts of concepts that we think we know and understand, or maybe we don't. Um, but you read a book like this and you hear the child wondering honestly and genuinely and honestly engaging with the stories, and I think that that's an important model. And again, I mean, I have an academic background. It's not that I devalue that or think it's not important, but it can also come with a kind of authority, like this is this is the way it is, this is how you need to think about it. And sometimes we need to be broken out of that so that we can um, yeah, we can engage truthfully ourselves and bring our own ideas and questions.
Well, and I just want to name and celebrate that gift within you, Laura, the sense that I know that you have an academic background and that you are a theologian in your own right, a preacher in your own right. Um, and through your lifelong learning journey, you have been given this gift to be able to take all of that and yet express it that it would be accessible to as many people as possible, but definitely accessible to a child. And that's a gift that um, a gift that not everybody is given, and certainly a challenge for many who have taken a route of an academic writing 360 pages of a thesis and everything else. It can be very difficult for them to articulate um, something as distilled down to less than 700 words, a concept, even how they communicate.
Thank you for acknowledging that. That actually means a lot to me.
Mhm.
Because confession time here, one thing that has kind of dogged me over the years is a sense, and I don't know whether it's coming from inside me or from outside, but sometimes there's this sense that, you did all of this study and you're writing picture books. Like, what are you doing? How? Um, and the word waste has actually been used with me, and it stings when someone says that to me. Um, but I'll tell you two little stories. One is when I think my second or third, no, maybe fourth or fifth book was coming out, and I had lunch with my thesis advisor, whom I hadn't seen in a long time. And I was a little bit nervous because if anybody has the right to say, hey, you wasted your education, it would probably be her. But she didn't say that at all. We got to the end and she said, this work lights you up. She said, I feel joy in you that I didn't feel when you were doing your PhD. No kidding. Yeah. And I think that, when we think about call, that there's an element of that too. It's like, what effect is this work having on me as a person? And I do feel joy when I'm able to create something and share it and feel that it's meaningful. And then the other was some communication I had or rather had with the person who had originally chaired my doctoral committee, and then he went back to England, so he couldn't supervise my thesis. But I'd asked him to look at a manuscript for one of these children's books, and again, I did have this sort of sense that, oh my gosh, is he gonna think that this is a come down somehow? And he said to me, "You do realize that way more people are going to read this than read your thesis." He said, "I feel like this is a really valuable contribution." And um, it's not that we all, need to be affirmed externally all the time, but gosh, it was really nice to hear people I respect say that. So yeah.
And I'm so glad you heard those words and had those interactions, and that those can anchor you as a part of your continuation in your ministry and what you
Hmm.
do. Um, ag- Acknowledging that, yeah, there's a lot of outside voices and inside voices that we're constantly working with. One of the themes at Ministry Forum is trying to help people understand the diversity of what ministry looks like.
Hmm.
Especially in our denomination, we've gotten a little bit like, unless you're a minister in a congregation, what really are you?
Yeah.
And I've heard that even as I've transitioned to this role at the college. There's just a sense that we have a sense that there's only one way to do ministry, and I think that's been a tragic reality for perhaps generations, or at least in the last 60 years,
Hmm.
that we've highlighted and elevated the congregational minister to such a level that it's now it's disenfranchised so many. And there's been
Hmm.
so many voices who've done amazing things and have offered their gifts in such a beautiful way in the church, and yet much of that has not been recognized, or it's been seen as that less than.
Less than, yeah.
Yeah, and that's
Yeah.
that's a tragedy. So we want to celebrate in Ministry Forum all the diversity of of what call might look like, what discernment is, and also recognizing that that's a journey. It's not necessarily something, in one moment you may be called to do this role, and in another moment you may be called to do a different role, and that's just the path that you've been set upon as inspiration and spirit has breathed into you to do those
Hmm.
things. And so I think for the Ministry Forum community, I'm hoping this is not only an advertisement for the books that you do, and I mean, I do want it to be that as well, to celebrate the books that you've created, and the books that are coming to be born in the next 10 books in the next few years. I mean, that's
Hmm.
amazing as well. Um, and I think this resource that you've created of the church year is a beautiful thing as well, and I hope folks will check that out and use that in their ministries. But also just the story of who you are and how you've walked this walk with Jesus, and with the journey of your life. Yeah, um, I would highly praise that person who said, "You're probably having a greater reach than many of us in ministry to have people read a story and be shaped and transformed in some way by that story." And so I celebrate that for you, Laura.
Well, I'm really grateful to you and to Ministry Forum for giving me the chance to tell more of this story, because yeah, I certainly didn't want this conversation just to be an advertisement for my books either. I mean, obviously, I want to sell books, but I wanted, yeah, I wanted our conversation to say more than that. And yeah, I
I
hope
appreciate
that
that.
it has. I hope that it's raised some questions for people. And
Hmm. It seems to have been a theme. This is our first. This is actually, this episode will probably be the first episode of our second season. And so last season, that some of that stuff just sort of percolated up. It wasn't intended. It just is how it goes. And I'm sure, as one who hangs in the creative world, it's sort of like, I didn't know where this came from. It just
yep.
sort of happened. It just sort of happened. Is there anything you'd want to share that you didn't get a chance to share, and you're thinking, hey, if John doesn't ask me this, I really need to say that?
think so, John, because the piece that I had in the back of my mind to say, we actually covered at the beginning. So, yeah, I feel like I've said what I need and want to say.
Spoken as a true picture book author. I have said what I need to say in the word count I've got, submitting it to the publisher. Let's get this thing recorded and let's be complete. Laura, I am so grateful for knowing you for over 20 years and then some. I'm so grateful to return to the college where I graduated, you graduated, and somehow we get to work on this same sort of staff team at Knox College, and just grateful for this conversation today. So thank you so much for taking some time to be with us on the Ministry Forum podcast.
My pleasure, John. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us today on the Ministry Forum podcast. We hope today's episode resonated with you and sparked your curiosity. Remember, you're not alone in your ministry journey. We're at the other end of some form of technology, and our team is committed to working hard to support your ministry every step of the way. If you enjoyed today's episode, tell your friends, your family, your colleagues. Tell someone. Please don't keep us a secret. And of course, please subscribe, rate, and leave a review in the places you listen to podcasts. Your feedback helps us reach more ministry leaders just like you. And honestly, it reminds us that we're not alone either. And don't forget to follow us on social media at Ministry Forum on all of our channels. You can visit our website at ministryforum.ca for more resources, keeping up with upcoming events, and ways to connect with our growing community. Until next time, may God's strength and courage be yours in all that you do. May you be fearless, not reckless, and may you be well in body, mind, and spirit, and may you be at